The war on drugs has been won without much success. President Nixon declared drugs to be America's number one enemy. Nixon's administration turned its focus on reducing drug use in America, and he created the first federal methadone program and dedicated much of the total drug budget to treatment and rehabilitation. The Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act was passed in 1970 and became the main law against drugs in America. 3 years later, in 1973, the Drug Enforcement Administration was created to enforce the law. President Nixon was not the only president to have a focus on the war on drugs. In August of 1989, when President Bush was elected, he dedicated his entire speech to continuing the war on drugs. There was a lot of support from the general public for the crackdown on drug abuse. After his speech, there were newspaper articles and editorials about the drug menace, drug lords and cartels, and the war on drugs. President Bush used a tough approach on drugs to harden his image after being seen as weak while he was vice president. Within a week of his speech, there was nearly a 65% agreement that drugs were a major issue facing this country. President Bush focused mainly on the supply side of drugs and keeping them from coming into the United States from other countries. The major problem with the war on drugs was that it didn't work and it penalized some groups more than others. The war on drugs did not prevent drug abuse or reduce the demand for drugs. It did not keep drugs out of the hand of teenagers and drug addicts, and it did not stop the flow of drugs into the United States. It is often believed that drugs are only a problem in poor ghettos. Drugs are said to be increasing the divide between the rich and the poor, while people use drugs at the same rate across economic and race standings. Oftentimes, minority groups such as blacks, Latinos, and women are overrepresented in the criminal justice system for drug charges. Many of these people come from poor communities. It is written in the Constitution that all people are created equally, therefore they should be charged equally. This is not the case for poor people of color compared to white people. In 1980, there were 40,000 inmates incarcerated for drug offenses. By 2003, we saw this number increase to 450,000. The growth of incarceration between 1980 and 2003 had a large overrepresentation of women. Poor women of color were marginalized as a result of globalization, leaving them to turn to criminality for economic survival. The United States incarcerates more women than any other nation. The war on drugs being the catalyst for their increased incarceration. In 1980, prior to the war on drugs, women accounted for 4.1% of all prisoners nationwide. In 2006, women accounted for 7.2%. In 1997, of the women who were incarcerated for drug convictions, 44% were Hispanic women, 39% were black women, and 23% were white women. There were different federal acts that were passed targeting drug abuse in 1986 and 1988. The passage of these bills put thousands of law enforcement agents into the field and increased the penalties for drug violators. With more drug cases coming in, the courts wanted to settle them faster. With new drug laws in place, harsher and more automatic sentences were given. With harsher sentences becoming the norm for drug offenses, more and more defendants were less willing to plead guilty to their crimes and more willing to go through longer trials. Many of them are serving very long sentences for non-violent low-level drug offenses. On November 1st, 1987, federal sentencing guidelines became effective. These guidelines required judges to sentence individuals based on mandatory minimum sentences. This eliminated almost all judicial discretion. The war on drugs was also said to have destroyed financial freedom. If you are caught with large amounts of money on you while you are traveling, or if you deposit more than $10,000 into the bank, you are now under suspicion for drug trafficking. If you are caught while traveling, you can be subjected to harassment and confiscation of your property, whether you have drugs on you or not. The consequences of the war on drugs did not stop with money. The war on drugs increased the use of police violence. Police officers were sued for kicking the door in onto the wrong house during a controlled drug buy, but were never charged. They strip searched female dancers in front of a group of cops because they were told by some other employees that the girls were selling prescription drugs. The war on drugs is still a problem today. We face many different challenges still with the use of heroin and other illegal drugs in America.